Women from all over the world took part in one of the biggest beauty pageants of India, Mrs. India International Queen 2022. Married women with high aspirations and a desire to contribute to the international community came as ambassadors of goodwill and participated in the biggest beauty pageant in India, Mrs. India International Queen 2022, to showcase their talent and live their dreams. The participants belonged to India and various other nations: Australia, the United States of America, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. Mrs. Pallavi Zadkar Tandon from Mumbai is the winner. Mrs. India International Queen 2022 and Mrs. Parul Sharma from Australia is the winner of Classic Mrs. International Queen 2022, where each winner received 1 lakh rupees in prize money. This year the grand finale of Mrs. India International Queen 2022 was held in New Delhi at the Leela Ambience Convention Hotel. Famous Bollywood star, Ms. Neelam Kothari Soni, along with Mr. Rohit Khandelwal, Mr. World 2016, and Mrs. Ankita Saroja, director of Mrs. India International Queen, crowned the winners of Mrs. India International Queen 2022 on 7th of November 2022 at the Leela Ambience Convention Hotel, Delhi. List of winner. Mrs. Madhura Somashekar from the United States of America won Mrs. India International Queen 2022 first runner-up and received 50,000 rupees in prize money, while Mrs. Manasadana Lakshmi from Hyderabad won Mrs. India International Queen 2022, second runner-up, and received 25,000 rupees in prize money. Whereas Dr. Snehal Deshpande from Mumbai won Classic Mrs. India International Queen 2022, first runner-up, and received 50,000 rupees in prize money, and Mrs. Aditi Taneja from Gurugram won Classic Mrs. India International Queen 2022, second runner-up, and received 25,000 rupees in prize money. The winners received not only prize money, but also extensive national and international media coverage. Be strong, be confident, be you was the theme of the event. Owing to its theme Be Strong, Be Confident, Be You, a series of other subtitle categories were also Mrs. India Fabulous 2022 won by Mrs. Manjari Vijayalkar, Mrs. India Fashion Icon 2022 won by Dr. Monica Saini, Mrs. India Graceful 2022 won by Mrs. Manasadana Lakshmi, Mrs. India Inspiring 2022 won by Mrs. Geeta Rajkumar, Mrs. India Beautiful Smile 2022 won by Mrs. Pallavi Zadkar Tandon, Mrs. India Popularity Queen 2022 and Mrs. India Vivacious 2022 won by Dr. Biraj Thakur, Mrs. India Diligent 2022 won by Mrs. Deepti Kalra, Mrs. India Adorable 2022 won by Mrs. Amrita Damebus, Mrs. India Courageous 2022 won by Mrs. Sudeshna Bandyopadhyay, Mrs. India Charismatic 2022 won by Mrs. Malarvazi Maheshwaran, Mrs. India Gorgeous 2022 won by Mrs. Deebalina Sarkar, Mrs. India Brilliant 2022 won by Mrs. Aditi Taneja, Mrs. India Best Rampak 2022 won by Mrs. Pallavi Kumar, Mrs. India Goodness Ambassador 2022 won by Dr. Snehal Deshpande, Mrs. India Tenacious 2022 won by Mrs. Vandana Dua, Mrs. India Congeniality 2022 won by Mrs. Mamta Mohan Singh, Mrs. India Perfectionist 2022 won by Mrs. Parul Sharma, Mrs. India Sparkling 2022 won by Mrs. Alta Sharma, Mrs. India Charming 2022 won by Mrs. Rekha Chauhan, Mrs. India Glamorous 2022 won by Mrs. Saroya Naidu, Mrs. India Spectacular 2022 won by Mrs. Leena Agarwal, Mrs. India Alluring 2022 won by Mrs. Swati Lingaraj, Mrs. India Exquisite 2022 won by Mrs. Priyanka Jain, Mrs. India Renaissance 2022 won by Mrs. Pragati Saxena, Mrs. India Ravishing 2022 won by Mrs. Sukriti Dhingra, Mrs. India Photogenic 2022 won by Mrs. Tina Shandila, Mrs. India Talented 2022 won by Mrs. Madhura Somashekar, Mrs. India Elegant 2022 won by Mrs. Gina Sandhu, Mrs. India Intelligent 2022 won by Dr. Neelu Khurana, and Mrs. India Sensational 2022 won by Mrs. Kalpana Dua. Mr. Shilobo was the official fashion director and choreographer for MIAC 2022, and the event was hosted by renowned MC Mr. Debajyoti Dasgupta. Portraits by Vedant was the official photographer and videographer for Mrs. India International Queen 2022. The makeup at the event was sponsored by Rajshri Makeup Studio and Academy. Since Ashok Darda took the self-defense training session, Mr. Vipin Gaur from VG Studios was associated as celebrity fashion photographer. Also Dr. Zahida Johal, director of Smile London, sponsored the event along with Kenchi TV and Kismat TV from the United Kingdom. The beauty and wellness sessions were organized by Dr. Soni Nanda, the dermatologist and esthetician from Moha Skincare, Noida, Delhi. Miak has been a very successful journey for countless married women in establishing their own identities. Mrs. India International Queen 2022, MIIQ, has been a very successful journey for countless married women in establishing their own identities and spreading a message of hope, strength, self-belief, and self-love in society. The beauty pageant, whose goal is to give women a platform where they can showcase their talent, was founded and directed by Mrs. Ankita Saroha. Sharing her views on MIIQ, Mrs. Ankita Saroha said, "I gained a great deal of respect, love, and recognition in society with my pageant journey, and I want to provide that amazing experience to every other woman as well." Observing the participants so fired up and prepared to take on the world is always heartwarming. The success of the beauty pageant was largely due to the enormous participation from both the live audience and the online audience. All married women compete in this pageant so that they can still pursue their goals and demonstrate their talents after getting married. Mrs. India International Queen is a platform to encourage women's empowerment and promote cultural heritage. In order to advance society and set an example for the rest of the world, Mrs. India International Queen was founded. Married women from all over the world can meet there and exchange cultural knowledge, thereby inspiring each other. Place New Delhi, India.